Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is Colonial Battle for North America, Nations at War timeline. I've done one of their videos I just released today about the Vikings, and it got blocked in certain countries. Like, I think it said 3% of the people won't be able to watch it. Apologies if you were one of them. Of course, you probably won't get this video, so apologies for that too. But anyways, this is a 43-minute video. I'm going to break it down into three, I'll call it 15 minutes, but it's 14 minutes. So let's get on with the video.
My name's Dan Snow, and I want to tell you about History Hit TV. It's like the Netflix for history. Hundreds of exclusive documentaries and interviews with the world's best historians. We've got an exclusive offer available to fans of Timeline. If you go to History Hit TV, you can either follow
and claim the continent for their empire. However, France's Ottawa allies were unbeaten, and they would meet any threat to their homeland with force.
Conquer, surrender, victory, defeat. These deadly battles shaped continents. These are nations at war.
Ever since their arrival in the 17th century, the empires of Europe had spent decades fighting the First Nations and each other for supremacy over North America. As kings and queens fought epic battles to draw lines on a map, indigenous peoples and European settlers burned each other's homes, locked in a near constant life and death struggle for the land itself. By the 1750s, decades of hostility had taken its toll on indigenous North America. Even nations like the Ottawa, who lived outside the main theaters of battle, had suffered. For generations, they had controlled the territory around the Great Lakes with their fellow Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. Together, their homelands formed one of the richest hunting grounds in North America and the gateway to the West. It was a hunter's paradise, which the Ottawa were willing to protect with force. To France, the Ottawa's position made them attractive allies. And in 1701, they built a fort at present-day Detroit to facilitate trade and cooperation. It was called Pontchartrain de Detroit.
Fort Pontchartrain de Detroit was built as a key fort that could control the trade networks. It sat on a very specific geographical and strategic spot.
The Ottawa's economy was bound to the French fur trade, as was their access to steel weapons, firearms, and ammunition. These weapons had defended the Ottawa from hostile nations for over 100 years. But the price of doing business with the French was an alliance against their ancient enemy, Great Britain. When fighting broke out in 1754, Ottawa chiefs were quick to answer France's call to arms. These warriors fought valiantly on the front line of many battles, but their courage could not save New France from occupation. The news of France's total defeat only reached the Ottawa in the fall of 1760, when a force of American Rangers under Robert Rogers were intercepted by Ottawa warriors along the shores of Lake Erie. The chief leading this party would soon become one of the most famous indigenous leaders in North American history, Chief Pontiac. Though the details of his life remain shrouded by rumors and propaganda, by the 1750s, Pontiac was the key Ottawa leader around Detroit. Luckily for Rogers, he hadn't come to fight. The Ranger was there to ask for peace. It was through Rogers that Pontiac learned how complete France's defeat in North America had been. When Rogers took Detroit without firing a shot, Pontiac knew he had to prepare for life without the French.
The Anishinaabe, after the 7 Years' War, continued to wonder whether or not they could trust the English. After all, we had been at war with them for 7 years.
The problem now was the French were gone. And the only empire that they were going to be dealing with was the British.
Pontiac had good reason to fear the new status quo, because the man chosen to pacify Britain's occupied territories would threaten everything Pontiac held dear. Geoffrey Amherst had been sent to North America during the height of the 7 Years' War, at a time when Great Britain was losing the battle for the continent.
Geoffrey Amherst was a very controversial man in his time and continues to be a controversial character even in the 21st century.
In 1759, Amherst and his subordinates unleashed a three-pronged offensive which reversed the course of the war. They swiftly overran New France's frontier forts and took the colonial capital of Quebec. When Amherst took Montreal in 1760, France's war was over. However, their Ottawa allies still had the strength to resist. While Amherst was an efficient military commander, he was a terrible choice to oversee the post-war occupation of New France. Amherst considered the First Nations inherently treacherous, and he was determined to treat nations like the Ottawa as conquered subjects of the British Empire.
Geoffrey Amherst despised First Nations because he was a product of his time. What I mean by that is he held the prejudicial and racial beliefs of many people of Anglo-Saxon heritage.
One of his first actions was banning the sale of guns and ammunition to French Canadians and Indigenous people. The Ottawa had used muskets for hunting and warfare for over a century. Denying them access to ammunition threatened their survival.
The English became the only superpower. The way they kept that status was to ensure that all the native nations were weaker. They'd become so reliant on trade goods that they really had lost their independence.
Pontiac decided not to wait until his people were too weak to fight back. In 1762, he sent runners to rally as many chiefs and warriors as he could to a secret meeting near Detroit, where Pontiac forged them into an armed resistance movement. His supporters included Ottawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wendat, Miami, and the multi-ethnic Wabash Confederacy. And Pontiac wasn't alone in his opposition to Britain. In the Ohio country, warriors from the Lenape, Shawnee, Mingo, and Seneca rallied around a chief named Gayasuta. Gayasuta had fought against the British during the 7 Years' War. Now he feared losing his people's land to American settlers. When the British began building outposts on land which belonged to Pontiac and Gayasuta's supporters, all of their fears were vindicated. If Geoffrey Amherst had hoped to intimidate the Ottawa into submission, he'd made a grave mistake. And Pontiac would make him pay for it.
Lightsabers are finally a reality, and you can own one. This new military flashlight is basically a lightsaber that fits in your pocket. But be warned, this
I haven't paused it or asked any questions just because it's interesting and I have nothing to add or to ask. So I'm doing it now. I'm just telling you, I have nothing to add.
It's 1763, and warriors are on the move across the Great Lakes. British General Geoffrey Amherst may have won the war against France, but he's losing control of Britain's newly acquired territories. Amherst's hostile approach to indigenous people has threatened nations like the Ottawa. In response, a chief named Pontiac forged an alliance strong enough to drive out the British.
The French had now been removed from power in North America. The indigenous groups that were once allied to the French feared for their future because, of course, this very important ally was gone. As well, the British looked to be expanding into new territory.
But they didn't really know what they were taking over because there were no firm boundaries, like here's the boundary between New France and the Mohawks or the Wendat.
Amherst had been warned against his aggressive approach to diplomacy by Britain's Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. Johnson had worked with the Mohawks to become rich and powerful, so he knew from experience that gift-giving and respect could win Britain friends and allies. Amherst, however, did the opposite, banning gift-giving to people he saw as conquered.
The French had greater success at making indigenous allies than the British because the French practiced this expansive and expensive program of gift-giving. One of the big triggers for Pontiac's rebellion was the fact, actually, that the British stopped the policy of gift-giving.
The Great Lakes nations were furious. One Ojibwe chief even warned British traders that Amherst's new policies could mean war. You have not conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. This warning fell on deaf ears. Amherst continued his policies, so Chief Pontiac rallied his warriors for battle. Pontiac's target was Fort Detroit, the key British outpost in the region. On May 7th, 1763, he led 300 warriors through the wilderness. Pontiac hoped to take the fort's garrison unaware, under the guise of friendship. But the garrison had been warned of Pontiac's intentions. After facing heavy resistance, his warriors were forced to retreat. Pontiac's failure to take the fort by surprise forced him to set up a siege which could starve Detroit's garrison out. Despite this setback, his actions served as a rallying cry for all those who had grown tired of Britain's occupation. On May 10th, British troops were ambushed at Point Pelee by Wendat warriors and lost 60 men. The survivors of this battle fled to Fort Sandusky, only to find it already destroyed by the Ottawa. By the time Chief Guyasuta moved against Fort Pitt in July, 8 British strongholds had been taken. As the forts fell, raiding parties descended on unprotected British settlements. An estimated 2,000 civilians were killed as Guyasuta and Pontiac's warriors set the American frontier on fire. Geoffrey Amherst had been warned not to provoke the First Nations. Now he faced a war his army wasn't ready to fight.
The British army was not prepared to fight a war against Pontiac in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Driven by hatred and desperation.
They didn't fight in the wilderness. I mean, they did, but they, lined up at like gentlemen, and that's not what natives did. So they were just going to get mowed down if they tried to fight that type of battle.
Amherst would resort to any means necessary to restore British dominance, even if it meant unleashing weapons of mass destruction. Summer 1763. In the Great Lakes region, the British Empire is under assault. Their forts have been burned by warriors from supposedly conquered nations. At Detroit, Chief Pontiac has the garrison trapped, but his army is in a dangerous position. In this kind of combat, mobility is the key to victory. But Pontiac was stuck in a static siege, and he lacked the two things necessary to succeed: supplies and artillery. For each day he sat outside Detroit's walls, Pontiac lost supporters.
You have to at some time go on the attack. You can't sustain a defensive position forever.
The First Nations coalitions also faced a looming counterattack. 250 soldiers under Captain Dalyell and Pontiac's old acquaintance, Robert Rogers. While at the same time, another 500 men under Henry Bouquet moved against Guyasuta's army outside Fort Pitt. Amherst had even given Bouquet some of the deadliest soldiers in the British Army. The Highlanders. Regiments like the Black Watch had been raised to pacify the clans of northern Scotland. By the 1750s, Highland units became feared as shock troops, recruited from some of the toughest and most desperate people in the British Isles.
I'm going to pause this here. This is part 1. And I will be back with part 2. Oh, would you two stop? Hey, shut up. So, like and subscribe, or some kid's going to fall into a well. I'm going to push him. Have a good day. Have a good night.